Good afternoon, and welcome. My name is Wallace Best, and I want to thank you all for being here on this very chilly afternoon. I'm a bit of a wimp when it comes to the weather, so I was tempted to stay away. No, I was not. I was very happy to be here, and despite the cold. And I want to thank the co-sponsors of this event, American Studies, the newly named Program in Gender and Sexuality Studies, the Center for the Study of Religion, the Department of Religion, the Center for African American Studies, and last but not least, African American Studies 365, Migration and Literary Imagination, my students. I've said all semester that they are sponsors of this event as well. Thank you all for being here. I'm very excited about having Isabel Wilkerson here with us this afternoon. Now, every once in a while, a book comes along that revives old conversations while it wondrously starts new ones. It introduces new voices, new perspectives, and new approaches that reflect back while pointing forward, that gives us new ways of thinking about who we have always been while showing us what we can become. Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's Great Migration, is such a book. Having only appeared in print within the last few months, the book has already captivated people all across the nation, as many are learning for the first time about the Great Migration, that time in our history when, as Richard Wright asserted, Black Americans were leaving the land for the streets of the city, and what Ray Stannard Baker called the most significant event in Black life since emancipation and Reconstruction. Beginning roughly around the First World War and lasting until the mid-1970s, the Great Migration changed everything about this country, demographically, socially, economically, politically, and culturally. Indeed, as Ms. Wilkerson shows in her remarkable narrative voice, the Great Migration, quote, changed American culture as we know it, unquote. And it is the detailing of the cultural transformations brought about by the migration that is perhaps the book's most significant contribution. No area of African American cultural production has been untouched by the mass movement of migration. Nearly every major Black artist who emerged during the 20th century can be connected to a region of the South and a story of his or her family's migration from that place, by car, by train, by bus, and sometimes by foot. Sometimes alone, sometimes en masse, but always in part as an expression of their freedom to do so. They left. The soundtrack of America, and perhaps that of many other parts of the world, would ring differently in our ears, I suspect, were it not for Aretha Franklin, whose father, C.L. Franklin, made his way from rural Mississippi to Detroit. Well, Al Green, whose family moved from Arkansas to Grand Rapids. Thelonious Monk from North Carolina to New York City. John Coltrane from North Carolina to Philadelphia. Ray Charles from Florida to Seattle. Thomas Andrew Dorsey from Georgia to Chicago. Mahalia Jackson from New Orleans to Chicago. Not to mention those countless contemporary artists who by now are the grandchildren of Southern migrants. Imagine a world without the songs Respect, Chain of Fools, Still in Love with You, Chasing the Train, Georgia on My Mind, or Precious Lord, Take My Hand. Unthinkable. After 20 years of research and writing, I don't want to think about it, that's a lot, and over 1,200 interviews, Isabel Wilkerson has produced a masterpiece. In The Warmth of Other Suns, we hear the voices of three principal Southern migrants, Ida Mae Gladney, George Swanson Starling, and Robert Joseph Pershing Foster, but the experiences of millions of others resonate in those voices, and we come to understand the range of motivations, push, pull, and personal, that prompted this mass exodus. Scholars and students of the Great Migration welcomed this fresh addition to the field, and we realize that the standard has been placed very high for books to follow that chronicle this most important event in our nation's history. Isabel Wilkerson won the Pulitzer Prize for feature writing for her work as Chicago bureau chief of the New York Times in 1994, making her the first black woman in the history of American journalism to win a Pulitzer Prize and the first African American to win for individual reporting. Wilkerson also won a George Polk Award, a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship for her research into the Great Migration, and she was named Journalist of the Year by the National Association of Black Journalists. She has lectured on narrative writing at the Nieman Foundation at Harvard University and has served as Ferris Professor of Journalism here at Princeton University, and as the James M. Cox Jr. Professor at Emory University. She is currently Professor of Journalism and Director of Narrative Nonfiction at Boston University. During the Great Migration, her parents journeyed from Georgia and Southern Virginia to Washington, D.C., where my family went to as well, Isabel, where she was born and reared. This is her first book. We welcome you, Isabel. Isabel Wilkerson.
Thank you so much. It is such an honor and such a special moment for me to be here on Princeton's campus. It is such a special, special place to me and has a special place in my heart and a special place in the gestation of this book. I want to thank Professor Wallace for that beautiful introduction. So you actually, I was clicking off the names that I might have mentioned as the famous people who are part of the migration. I don't have to mention them now, so thank you. I want to thank the Center for African American Studies and the entire Princeton community because this place is so very special to me. I lived over on Alexander when I was here as Ferris Professor. And as I was Ferris Professor here, which was such a beautiful experience for me, absolutely beautiful experience, it was just as I was taking to the open road of research on this book. I had, by that moment, found the subjects, these three amazing characters, these three amazing protagonists that make up the spine of this book. And in order to find them, I had to spend many years, about 2 years, traveling all over the country to what are known as the receiving stations of the Great Migration, meaning New York and Chicago and Milwaukee, Oakland and Los Angeles, all the places in the North and the West that the people went. And I would go to senior centers, and I went to AARP meetings, and I went to Baptist churches in Harlem, Baptist churches in Harlem, but also Baptist churches in Brooklyn, where everybody was from South Carolina. I went to Catholic churches in Los Angeles, where everyone was from Louisiana. So I went all over the place, quilting clubs and Senior Day picnics, Juneteenth celebrations. I even had a booth at a Juneteenth celebration to find the people who would ultimately be these three characters in this book. It was in some ways an audition, a casting call for the people who would be the scaffolding, the voices through whom the story would be told of the millions who they would end up having to represent. These three streams, I should indicate, that make up this Great Migration, which, as Professor Best indicated, began in World War I and did not end until the 1970s. The three major streams would be first the one up the East Coast, which took people from Florida, the Carolinas, Georgia, and Virginia to Washington, D.C., to Philadelphia, to New Jersey, to New York, obviously, and to Boston. The second stream was that took people from Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Tennessee, up to Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Minneapolis even, the Midwest. And the final stream, the stream that actually was in some ways most exciting because it was the one that had been the least mined, and that was the one that took people from Louisiana and Texas to Los Angeles, Oakland, and the entire West Coast. So that was what I was working on. Finally, it found the three amazing people. One was Ida Mae Gladney, who was a sharecropper's wife in Mississippi, who was the first chronologically to leave in the course of the book, the narrative of the book. She left in 1937. She'd been a sharecropper's wife in Chickasaw County, Mississippi, and was terrible at picking cotton, just awful at it. I mean, you don't even think of people being good or bad at it, you just do it. Well, actually, there is a hierarchy. Wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, there's a hierarchy that will ensue. And so there actually were people who had bragging rights about being able to pick however many hundreds of pounds of cotton, and she was not good at it. And she didn't mind telling me that. She and her family ended up having to leave because a cousin had been wrongfully accused of a theft that he had not committed. The thing that they thought he had stolen turned up the next day, but he had been beaten to within an inch of his life. And after seeing what had happened to his cousin, her husband came home and said to her, "This is the last crop we're making." And they left Mississippi for Milwaukee first, which was the trajectory from that part of Mississippi. This migration was so specific in many cases that there were certain parts of a region of a state that were feeder regions for a particular town in the north, which is astounding. And so the place that people went from her part of Mississippi was a place called Beloit or either Milwaukee itself. And so she followed that route, and then they ended up in Chicago, which was also a place that many of the people from her part of Mississippi went. And so that was one of the people that I found. The one who represented the East Coast migration was George Swanson Starling, who had been he'd been a college student, but the money had run out, and he had to return to the region of his birth, where his family was, which was Central Florida, and return to the work of the people from where he had come. And that meant picking fruit, which was the work that the people did there. But because he'd had some schooling, he had a different view of things than he had before, and he could see how the people were being taken advantage of, how the work was dangerous as it was. They were having to climb into 40-foot trees. People would reach for a grapefruit and instead grab hold of a hornet's nest and fall from the tree. They might break a leg or worse, and yet there was nothing for them. There was no workman's compensation. They just were out of luck. So the work was dangerous, but it also was low paying. They were being paid 10 cents, 12 cents for a box of fruit that was going to go out on the open market for $4. He could read, and all of them could. There was no apology made as to the fairness or justice of it, or injustice of it. And so he began to do the unthinkable thing, which was in the 1940s, attempt to negotiate higher wages. The South had not been very amenable to unions in any case, and particularly in the 1940s, when in fact many African Americans were subject to peonage laws where a black person could be arrested on the street for not working on a Saturday. It was unthinkable. It was dangerous. It was in some ways insanity to think that one could actually expect to get more out of the grove owners than they had been willing to give. But he attempted to do it anyway, and they had some victories, but ultimately he had to flee for his life, and he headed to Harlem in 1945. And then the third and final person, which brings me to Princeton, is the Dr. Robert Joseph Pershing Foster, who had been a surgeon in the Army, a captain actually. But when he got out of the Army after the Korean War, it turned out that he could not practice surgery in his own hometown of Monroe, Louisiana. And so he decided that he would set out on a course for California, which was his vision of the American dream. He had never been to California, hadn't seen it before. He had bragged quite a bit to the people from his hometown that he was going and that they should go with him, and he didn't understand why they would take the Jim Crow situation that he felt they were accepting. But he set out on a course for California, and it was far more treacherous and perilous than he had anticipated, because it turned out that the boundaries of Jim Crow, as were popularly understood at the time, extended beyond the formal borders that people might have expected. And it turned out that he could not find a place to rest, could not find anyone who would rent a room to him beyond the borders of Texas once he got past the place he had stayed in New Mexico. And so he had to drive for many states, many hundreds of miles that he had not anticipated having to do at night, through curving hairpin turns along the mountains and in the desert, where the settlements are often 80 miles apart even now. and it turned out that he could not find a place to rest. It was dangerous to do so. It was harrowing and disheartening for him to have to do this. And during the course of that ride, when it became apparent that his dream for a better life might not be what he had hoped it would be, he began to have this disheartening recognition that perhaps even this might not be the place for him. But he was too far along in it, and he had to go forward. This was a journey that I attempted to recreate myself. Years later, I had my parents with me, and we were trying to make it through, and I wanted to follow it to the letter. I wanted to know, because the goal of the book was to help make real, to humanize assumptions, to fill in the blanks of much of the history that we think we know and actually didn't know that much about at all, mainly because a lot of it because people often didn't talk about it. But essentially, I wanted to be able to make it come alive for the reader. I wanted to experience what he'd experienced, where you're gripping the wheel for so long and you're already overdue for sleep anyway, and you're so exhausted that your hands are gripping the wheel that they begin almost to lock in place, that your eyes grow so heavy and weary from the lack of sleep that they begin to ache, that you turn and you're driving and you can't see and there's no light, and then before you is a hairpin turn that you had not anticipated. My parents were in the car with me, and at a certain point, they said, you're veering from the road. This is dangerous. We must stop. You must stop the car, and if you won't stop the car, just let us out. Because they had lived through Jim Crow, through this caste system, and they felt that now they were reliving it again in a way that they didn't feel it was quite necessary. This was a nice little experiment you're trying to do, but really, there's a hotel or motel, there's a sign I saw for a Holiday Inn or whatever it was, and we should stop. We, of course, did stop, and we had no trouble at all, because it's proof of just how far we have come as a country. It really was not that long ago that Robert Joseph Pershing Foster was having to drive across the country without the ability to stop, and that African Americans, whenever they did venture out, had to take little books with them, little green books that were often out of date the moment they were printed, but that would offer them hope. They were guidebooks. They were like little equivalents of the AAA guidebook that would say, these are the places where you can stop if you're in Memphis. This is a rooming house where you might find a place to sleep in Birmingham. This is a restaurant that might serve you in Jackson, Mississippi. Or even, these are the places that you might stay if you are in Phoenix or you are in Salt Lake City, because even some of those places could not be certain that they'd have a place to stay. And so we're not that far from the era that I'm speaking of. It was while I was here at Princeton that I had settled into having chosen these three amazing people. And I was setting out on a course of trying to spend time with them. It was awfully convenient because one of the people was here in New York, so being here in Princeton helped greatly. I was living in Chicago, so that was always something that could be done, and I enjoyed so much talking with Ida Mae Gladney in the times that I had to spend with her. But I'd often have to make trips out to Los Angeles, too, and when I'd return, my students would always ask me, how did it go? Because I was teaching a course called The Press and Social Issues, and this was exactly what they were doing, which was, it was interdisciplinary, and it was a little ethnography, participant observation, journalism all blended together, which is exactly what was required to do this book, and they'd want to know how it went. And there were times during that period where I'd return from a trip and they'd want to know how it had gone. And I'd have to tell them, and this is the ethnographer's reality, that I didn't get a chance to spend as much time with him as I had hoped. When I arrived, he was already in the hospital. And so they were the most empathetic students, and they wanted to hear all about it, and they wished me well in hopes that the next time I would go, I'd be able to talk with him. And so it has been that long since I've actually been here on this campus, so it means a great deal to me. I almost got this feeling as I was coming up to the Nassau Inn, and I had this sense of recognition on the street and seeing the buildings that had meant so much to me at a critical moment in the gestation of the book. So what was this Great Migration? This Great Migration was, as Professor Best described it, it was an outpouring of 6 million African Americans from World War I until the 1970s, when the primary motivations and reason for the migration had essentially come to an end. And that was that the caste system under which they were living had been essentially dismantled by then, finally, well after actually the passage of the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1968. The South was slow to implement those laws, and many of them had to be taken to court in order to do it, but by the 1970s they had done so. And so some of the essential reasons, one of the overarching realities for all of the people who were part of this great migration, this caste system, had essentially legally come to an end. I describe this migration as not just people moving, because it was not just people moving. It was in many ways a defection. It was a defection, a kind of seeking of political asylum from a caste system that had ruled their every movement in life. From the moment they would awaken to the moment they went to sleep, there were rules, protocols, requirements, and strictures that determined what Black people could do, what African Americans could do, and what white people could do, which meant that everyone was in some ways bound by, restricted by the rules of a caste system, and it was dangerous not to know what the rules were. Your very life depended upon it if you were Black and white, actually. There were many white people who would there were lawyers who would try to defend people who might have been accused of breaking the caste system, and they were often censured. And of course, there were many ways that were used to enforce this code, this caste system, on the African Americans who lived under it. A couple of examples of how this caste system operated. You should know that there are no references in the book to water fountains or restrooms. I researched for many months, just trying to find any manifestation, any law, the most arcane and unbelievable law that someone happened to have written down. I searched them out so that there would be no need to include restrooms and water fountains, the things that we initially think of when we think of the Jim Crow South. Because in some ways that was the least of it. An example of this is that in Birmingham, for example, it was against the law for a Black person and a white person to play checkers together. Against the law for a Black person and a white person to play checkers together. Somebody actually sat down and wrote that out as a law. Someone must have seen a Black person and a white person playing checkers, having just a little too much fun, too good a time, and decided that the entire foundation of Southern civilization was at risk and we cannot have this, and therefore wrote a law out forbidding that from happening in Birmingham. There were Black telephone booths. There are no telephone booths now, but there were Black telephone booths and white telephone booths in Oklahoma, of all places. So two separate, and if you need to make a phone call, oh, I can't go to this one because it's for another race. It's astounding to even think about that. In South Carolina, Blacks and whites could not walk up the same staircase in the same workplace. That meant if everybody was carrying a particular thing, a sack of flour or whatever it was that they were working on or making, they could not, how do you even negotiate that? They could not go up the same staircase at the same time. So that the logistics of that actually hurt everyone. How efficient can you possibly be as an assembly line or as a company if many of your workers cannot be doing the same thing in the same place at that same moment? And there were, in courtrooms throughout the South, there was a Black Bible and a white Bible to swear to tell the truth on. That meant that if a white person took the stand, there was a Bible that was brought out, a King James Bible that was brought out for them to swear to tell the truth on. And if a Black person took the stand, they had to get a different Bible. And how I discovered this was in a newspaper in North Carolina, in which they were not describing the bizarre nature of the law. They were merely describing that it had caused a little bit of a delay in that day's proceedings in one courtroom. And the reason for the delay was because they could not find the Black Bible for the black eyewitness, the witness that had come to take the stand. So they had to halt the proceedings, find the Bible. Now, they had the white Bible, but they could not have this person swear to tell the truth on that Bible. So they had to suspend the proceedings. The bailiff and all of them are, can you imagine just searching the courtroom to find the Bible that the black people swear to tell the truth on? I mean, it's an example of anything that could be devised was written down. Anything that could be imagined that would allow the different members of the different levels of this caste system to be viewed as similar or the same or equal, there had to be a law to prevent that from happening. And that was the extent of what they were living under. One other example that actually, when I tell it to young people, for whatever reason this really gets to them, is the fact that it was generally custom as another manifestation of Jim Crow, of this caste system, that when, if a black motorist came to an intersection and there was a white motorist that came afterward, they had to wait and let the white motorist go first. If a black motorist was behind the wheel and driving behind, and there was a white motorist in front of them, they could not under any circumstances pass that person. It didn't matter how slow they were going or if they were lost and still trying to find their way and the other person knew where they were going, they could not pass that white motorist. That was what was the law and the protocol under Jim Crow, under the caste system that they lived under. And these are all just the everyday, nervous-making realities on everyone's part, because everybody had to know, woe be to anyone who crossed over the line in either direction. So you can imagine how stressful it had to have been to live under these rules and to learn what the rules might have been in all these different places. And so these are, in some ways, the realities that they were leaving. But the ultimate reality was that this caste system, if you think about a caste, C-A-S-T-E, which is not what we often think of in the United States, but I think as I've spent so much time marinating, I also want to amend a comment that was made. I didn't spend 20 years. It was bad enough how much time I spent. I mean, it was 15 years. I often tell people that if it were human, it would be a teenager and dating. But it would not be in college yet. So that's why I want to correct that. But I spent so much time immersed in the world to try to recreate it for the reader that I came to see it as really, truly a caste system. And that if you think of caste, C-A-S-T, interesting that these two words have some similarities. They mean totally different things, but they have some similarities. One of the similarities is that a caste is an artificial bounding device that holds something fast in its place. And that is in some ways what a caste system does, C-A-S-T-E. Now they're totally different, but they have a similar goal, a similar purpose. And that is the exact same thing. It's artificial and in some ways never meant to be there for very long. And in order for this caste system in the South to be maintained, it required tremendous amounts of vigilance and vigilantism in the form of lynchings, which occurred somewhere in the South every 4 days during the period of time that we are talking about. This caste system existed. It began formally with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 and did not end until essentially 1968 with the last of the major civil rights acts. So it went on. It lived for as long as a fairly healthy man. It afflicted the lives of multiple generations, and it was one of the precipitating factors in the mass departure of 6 million people from the South to the North and the West. The goal of this book for me in some ways was to breathe life into what we thought we knew about a part of American history that was in some ways so vast and affected so many aspects of our life and our culture, our politics, our geography, our way of being, our language, music, dance, art, literature, that in some ways it's hard to extract it from all these other things. It's so much a part of the 20th century that it almost went unrecognized in the fullness of what it was. And that was because when it began during World War I, and it began because Northern industry needed labor because of the war in Europe. And the war in Europe had disrupted the flow of immigration to the United States, which had been dependent upon, that labor had been dependent upon in order to fuel the factories, the foundries, the railroads, the steel mills of the North. That they were essentially the engines of those industries. And without ready access to that labor, the northern industry began to look around and try to figure out where shall we find the labor to replace these people. And the South was in some ways like an emerging market within the borders of our own country. And they went to where the cheapest labor was. The cheapest labor, you couldn't get much cheaper than free labor because many of the people who were there were, if not even the highest status person, African American in the South, was being underpaid. The teachers were being underpaid by 50, 60% in some cases. And that was the people who were educated. And the people who were not educated, many of them were not being paid at all. They were working for the right to live on the land they were farming. And so the northern industry decided to turn to these people and began to recruit them during World War I. It was that World War I recruitment effort that opened the floodgates to what we now know as the Great Migration. More people migrated and left the South during World War I. More African Americans left the South during World War I than all the preceding decades after emancipation. That is huge. That's just unimaginable. About 500,000 people left during World War I. And it's almost as if it had opened up the untapped desires of people to leave, but they did not have any way of seeing how they could make a go of it. And suddenly when the North made this call for workers, they were ready to answer that call. The South did not respond very well to the poaching of their cheapest labor, and they went to great efforts to keep them from leaving, especially the World War I generation. They would arrest African Americans from their seats on the northbound trains. They would arrest them wholesale on the railroad platforms as they were trying to leave. When that didn't work, they would wave the train on through so it would not stop if there were large numbers of African Americans waiting to board a northbound train. That was what they did when it came to the supply. When it came to the demand, they set out exorbitant fees for any northern industry, anyone who wanted to recruit black labor from the South to the North, it's just hard to fathom. I mean, it's like saying a major Fortune 500 company cannot come into Houston and recruit somebody who they'd like to be their marketing manager. I mean, it's insane. It would never happen now. But they actually set out a licensing fee that they required. It's almost as if they resurrected some of the exact same codes that they'd used during slavery. And in Macon, Georgia, for example, in order to recruit black labor, you had to first register with the city. You had to get 10 businessmen, 10 ministers, and 10 community people to sign on, which of course in Macon, Georgia, they were not. And you had to pay a $25,000 licensing fee, which would have been, that's huge now. That would have been astronomical in 1918. And so they went to great effort to keep people from leaving. And I want to read to you what an excerpt from an editorial that ran in the Macon Telegraph. Everybody seems to be asleep about what is going on right under our noses. That is, everybody but those farmers who have waked up on mornings recently to find every Negro over 21 on his place gone. To Cleveland, to Pittsburgh, to Chicago, to Indianapolis. And while our very solvency is being sucked out beneath us, we go on about our affairs as usual. So there was a great deal of hand-wringing among Southerners in the upper caste, the ruling caste, the dominant caste, as to what to do about this. It was said that some decided that maybe they should treat the workers better. And so one planter announced with some sense of accomplishment that he had decided to put aside his whip and gun, and therefore his workers should feel better about staying. So this was the world that they were leaving. I want to read a little bit about one of the characters. I want to read an excerpt from it, because the goal of this book was to humanize an assumption, to breathe life into what we thought we knew about the migration, to try to elevate it to its rightful place in history. It's my view, after having spent so much time on this, that no discussion of the 20th century is really complete without making mention of this great migration. It was so hard to write about or to grasp while it was occurring, because it went on for so long. And at each interval, people thought it was over. They declared it over after World War I. Well, there's no more reason for them to come because the war is over. It had not even really truly begun yet. In fact, because there would be many, almost three times as many people left during World War II as in World War I. And it went on unabated even during the Depression, when there was no guarantee of work in the North, and it was cold besides. And so at each interval, it was declared over, but they hadn't really talked with the people to find out that, no, they had decided that they were still going to be coming. And so it's hard to write about, and why I call it the biggest underreported story of the 20th century, because it was not reported by journalists in the way that one would expect now. It was not reported because in the early days of it, actually, Carl Sandburg, the great poet, actually had been a reporter at one of the Chicago newspapers, and he was one of the earliest people to write about it. Well, by the time the migration had ended, most of the people who might have been there to record the earliest arrivals at the 12th Street Station or at Penn Station or at the bus terminals in Detroit would have been retired or even have passed on. And so there was no ability to have the continuity to follow it all the way through. And that's how it fell under the radar screen from that perspective. The other thing that happened is that once the people had arrived, the story then turned to what was the life, what were the circumstances of their existence in the cities. The story then turned to the overcrowding in what became ghettos. Ghettos not because the people wanted to live in ghettos, but because it was not the migration itself, but it was the reaction to the migration, meaning the reaction of the cities was that these people will stay in this one area and they will not be permitted to move outside of this area. They were not permitted to move outside of an area where the police looked away as vice and crime flourished. These are people who were country people. These are people who were right off of the land. These are people who were not dressed properly. They were still wearing burlap sacks basically as clothing. And so these were people who were in some ways not prepared for the world that they were in. They doubled up and tripled up in kitchenette apartments. They took 2 and 3 jobs in order to make ends meet, and still the money didn't seem to add up, because even though they were making astronomical amounts of money compared to what they were making in the South, everything was much more expensive in the North, and so they found that the money was not going as far. There's a funny story that I just heard as I was speaking to someone, speaking at an event, and one of the people who had been a descendant of this migration said that one of her uncles had gone north and brought his first check back to his mother in Georgia. When he got into the house and showed her the check, she said, "Oh my goodness, we're going to have to hide this. Where can we put this? People will not believe the money that we have here. Someone is going to steal it for sure. And we need to put this away, because that was enough to feed them to take care of them for a year or more." That's the difference between what they were able to make in the North and what they were able to make in the South, and the gap between the two. The other thing that they did that was so similar to what I argue is this was in some ways an immigration experience within the borders of our own country, an unrecognized immigration experience within our own country. These people left with the same desires, heart's desires, hopes and dreams as any person who has ever crossed the Atlantic in steerage, crossed the Rio Grande or the Pacific Ocean, in hopes that life might be better, maybe not even for them, but by the time someone is in an immigrant status, meaning that the person who's actually making the decision to leave, they already, if they were coming from a region where the best they could do when it came to education was 8 years, or 8 years of education, 8th grade, or they could finish the 11th grade, but it was substandard by definition because it was separate and not equal, then it was too late for them if they were already 30 years old and had a couple of kids. But maybe it would be better for their children. And that is the immigrant's desire. They were not immigrants, and they should not have had to leave one region of their own country in order to experience the rights and privileges that should have come from birth and hard work for generations in this country, and yet that is what they were forced to do within the borders of our own country, and not that long ago, within the time period of most people walking the earth today. This migration unfolded. This defection wore on during the course of the lives of many people who are walking the earth today. And so that was one of the goals that I wanted to achieve in discussion. So I want to give you a couple of facts that put in perspective the magnitude of this migration. Before the migration began, 90% of all African Americans were living in the South. By the time this migration was over, nearly half, about half, were living outside of the South, from Washington, D.C. to Philadelphia, New York, all the way over to Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, and all the way over to the West Coast. They were living anywhere but the South. It was a redistribution of a good portion of an entire people. It also means then that the majority of it, not all, but the majority, the vast majority of African Americans that you meet in the North, the Midwest, and West are descendants of this great migration. And that's where we get to all of these names, these people who were able to flourish. They were able to flourish. Their parents had made this great sacrifice, this leap of faith, to leave the only place that they had ever known, as immigrants do, for a place that they had never seen in hopes that life would be better. But it was the children, that first generation often, and even the grandchildren, who are the prime beneficiaries of the actions of those people. And that is how we get people such as Professor Toni Morrison, whose parents migrated from Alabama to Ohio, where she had the luxury, the necessary opportunity to go into a library and to take out a book, which would not have been possible in Alabama at the time that she was growing up. Her parents spared her that indignity and gave her the opportunity to be able to read, have opportunities to read, which she would not have had in the South. And it's a really important thing if you're going to become a Nobel laureate, to be able to have access to books, kind of basic. August Wilson, the playwright, Romare Bearden, the artist, Jacob Lawrence, who essentially spent so much of his career with the famous tableau, the famous paintings of the migration itself. And that's literature and art. We often talk about the music, but literature and art would not be the same. Richard Wright, who was in some ways the bard of the Great Migration and who was the inspiration for the title of the book, The Warmth of Other Suns. I'll show it to you. The title comes from a passage that I discovered of his. It was not in the text itself, it was in the footnotes of his autobiography, which was called Black Boy. Originally, he had wanted it to be called American Hunger. And the second half of that book was cut. And at the last minute, he had to come up with a distillation of everything that would have been represented in that second half. And he wanted it published, and he did what he had to do. And so he found a way to distill it. And that distillation is not in the version that we now get. We now get the benefit of seeing it as he wished it to be seen. So what I actually found was in the footnotes on page 496, and it's beautiful. It shows you how the artist can distill something under great stress and maybe come up with the most beautiful lines that they might ever have come up with. And so what he wrote was this: I was leaving the South to fling myself into the unknown. I was taking a part of the South to transplant in alien soil, to see if it could grow differently, if it could drink of new and cool rains, bend in strange winds, respond to the warmth of other suns, and perhaps to bloom. Those are the words of Richard Wright, and in some ways they are an inspiration for anyone of any background who had the courage to leave all that they knew for a place that they had never seen. I find it to be a universal classic American story. It's my family's story because my mother migrated, as Professor Bessett indicated, from Rome, Georgia, to Washington, D.C., and my father from Southern Virginia to Washington, D.C. They would never have met had there been no Great Migration. And so I don't know who would be standing up here in front of you, but it would not be me, because they met there, married, and had me, and they would never have met otherwise. And that is a classic American story. I mean, the vast majority of Americans are descended from some people who came from far, far away and met here and started whole new lineages. I mean, how many people in America have a great-great-grandmother who met a great-great-grandfather, great-great-grandmother from Ireland who met a great-great-grandfather from Italy, and they met on the Lower East Side of Manhattan or in Chicago or in Boston and started a whole new lineage, and therefore creating whole new family lines here that would never have existed had someone had not had the courage to leave all that they knew for something better here. I want to, there's so much that I could say, but I want to conclude by reading the fruits of the labor that kind of came into bloom here at Princeton, because so much of my focus at that moment was on the discovery that this person that I'm about to read to you was sick. And so a lot of my focus in talking with students about the rigors and in some ways the occupational hazards of anyone doing qualitative research, of anyone doing ethnography, journalism as well, all of these things in which we depend upon real people. There is an occupational hazard that things happen to them. And so that weighed on me the entire time that I was here teaching. And I want to read to you from my introduction to him in this book. And his name is Dr. Robert Joseph Pershing Foster. Los Angeles, 1996. The paneled door rises a story high and would befit a museum or government office, but is actually the front door of a Spanish revival south of Wilshire. The door opens and there stands a one-time bourbon-swilling Army captain and deft-handed surgeon who, now in his later years, is a regular at the blackjack tables and the trifectas at Santa Anita. But he is, at the heart of it all, and perhaps most important, a long-standing, still bitter, and somewhat obsessive expatriate from the 20th century South, the heartbreak Jim Crow land he chose to reject before it could reject him again. He is a Californian now, this Robert Joseph Pershing Foster. He is the color of strong coffee and has waves in his hair which he lets grow as untamed as Einstein's, but then brushes back like the boys in the band. He's wearing a white cotton island shirt, loose slacks and sandals, the uniform of the well-to-do LA pensioner. He has the build and bearing of a Sammy Davis Jr., and not a little of the showmanship and delightful superficiality that seem to grow on people in certain circles of LA. I read that in LA and I worried just as I got to that phrase, maybe I should have edited that out. But you know what their reaction was? Yep, that's us, we're superficial. Yep, that's us. They loved it. He walked straight-backed and slew-footed into the foyer, past the curved faux Gone with the Wind staircase and the East Asian pottery. He gestures toward the living room, an imposing space that dwarfs him in its volume, fairly frozen in the seafoam carpet and hot pink tulip chairs out of a sherbety Doris Day movie from the 50s. The whole effect is as starched and formal as the tuxedos he used to wear to the parties he threw for himself back when his wife Alice was alive and the money was raining down like confetti. He seems accustomed to people fawning over the place, and with the prim air of leading men of his favorite movies from back in the 40s, insists on serving his guests a slice of lemon pound cake and vanilla ice cream on Rosenthal china, whether they would like to have it or not. His heavy-lidded eyes look straight into those of his listener and have a distractingly thick fringe of lashes like those seen on babies and starlets. He is a physician, or was for most of his adult life, and by most accounts a very good one, and is prone to pontificate like a man of his years and accomplishments. But he is just as likely to interrupt himself and check the time to see if he can still make the 1 o'clock at the Hollywood Park racetrack, which was another reason that there was often a delay whenever I would go and see him. His photo albums are filled with an unlikely assortment of bookies and blues singers and dentists and fraternity men and surgeons and society people whose approval he craved, even though he knew they were too pretentious to matter really. He doesn't say it because it would be gauche and hardly worth mentioning from his point of view, but there happened to be a lot of little Roberts around town due to the fact that over the years he delivered a number of baby boys whose mothers were so grateful for his firm hand and calming reassurances at the precise moment of truth that they named their sons not after their husbands, but after the doctor who delivered their babies. Before he begins to tell you his story, he tells you it's a long one and you can't get it all. He's lived too many lives, done too much, known too many people, ridden so high and so low that there's no point in fooling yourself into thinking you can capture the whole of it. You could try, of course, and he agrees to give as much as he can. I love to talk, he says, a smile forming on his still chiseled face as he sits upright in his tulip chair. And I am my favorite subject. Thank you very much. I would love to take your questions.
Thank you, Isabel. Professor Wilkerson has graciously said that she would take a few questions from the audience, but I wanted to make an announcement. I neglected to mention that there are books on sale, and there will be a book signing after the event and a reception. So stick around for that. But we'll have some time for a few questions. Professor Tillman.
How different were the experience of the migrants as they reached the three different sites, the East Coast, the Midwest, and California?
That's a really great question, because I purposely chose people who would reflect different experiences at the front end, on the journey, and ultimately in the receiving station that they chose to go to. And in some ways it reflects the level of education, their own socioeconomic class, and what might be described as their own temperament. In other words, how well were they able to respond to the challenges, in some ways the outright hostility, and the rigors of arriving in overcrowded, anonymous cities that were not necessarily hospitable to people, regardless of their background, if they were coming from a rural or small town experience. And so, of course, the person who had the most difficult time, certainly economically, would have been Ida Mae, the person who'd been a sharecropper's wife. She had an extremely difficult time because she was arriving during the Depression. It was a difficult time for women in general. And at that time, in particular, because men could find work in the foundries. And when I say find work, I mean the dirtiest, most dangerous work, truly, these people were forced to bear. But the women often had a difficult time finding any kind of work. And so she didn't have, these are people who had the least skills, the least education, and they were arriving in a very, very competitive place during the middle of the Great Depression. So all those combinations meant that it was going to be really difficult for her. One of the things that sprang up that I discovered I had not been aware of was that during that time, many African American women would gather at particular street corners in the Bronx, at Grand Concourse, different parts of New York, also certain parts on the south side of Chicago, and they would gather in the bitter cold at the break of day, and they would sit on crates and wait for well-to-do women. These would be mainly white women who were living in the North, to come and to choose among them who would come and help them clean the house for the day. This is called day's work, and there was no guarantee of anything beyond that particular day. And they often, what was so tragic in many ways about it was that they were often competing with one another. They were competing against one another to be chosen. So they would bid down their own prices to the point where many of them were making less than they might have made had they been picking cotton for a day in the South. But it was what they needed to do in order to survive once they'd gotten up there. It's an interesting thing about immigrants, for all of the people that in the book, and for it's a basic human trait, is that when people migrate, to migrate is very human anyway, and this is an attempt to tell a human story that happened to unfold within the borders of our own country. But when people make this great leap of faith, and everyone in their home region knows that they're about to leave, and many of the people in that home region have told them, I don't know if it's a good idea for you to leave. What's going to happen to you when you get up there? You know it's cold in the North, and who knows what kind of job you'll get, and who will you stay with, and where shall you live? So all of the doubts and fears that might have been instilled in them, and yet they still left, meant that they had to succeed. There's something about an immigrant spirit, a migrant spirit, that says no matter what we have to go through, we must succeed. success being a relative term. It didn't mean that they were going to become CEOs of major Fortune 500 companies or own skyscrapers. That was not even their goal. Their goal was to be able to survive in the North and to get out from underneath the caste system under which they had been forced to live. And so survival was in some ways a form of success. But the idea of failure was not an option, as failure is not an option for any immigrant, truly. And these people ended up, there were a lot of pressures on them because a lot of them were looking, the people back home were looking for money to come back. I mean, one of the things that immigrants do, they were not immigrants, but their behavior was that of immigrants in many respects. And so they were sending money back home, as immigrants often do. They were doubled up and tripled up in flats, as was Ida Mae. They were working long hours, multiple different kinds of jobs, and sending money back because the people back home were expecting them to. The migration played a role beyond just that of these individuals. It had a role in leading us to the civil rights movement, and I would like to make sure I get this point across, and I thank you for reminding me of that with your question. And that is that the migration fills the void in what we often skip over this period of time, and we think about Reconstruction, we think about the Harlem Renaissance, then we think about the civil rights movement. Well, some things were happening in between there. And one of the things that was happening was that the South was under tremendous pressure because it was losing massive amounts of its cheap labor that it had depended upon, taken for granted, in fact. And this migration did three things. One is it proved to both the workers themselves, the people who stayed and those who were leaving, that the lowest caste members of the South had options and were willing to take them. That had not happened before this Great Migration. Secondly, it provided a safe haven for those people who were going to stay and fight. If things were to become difficult, they had a place to go. They also had seen how life could be different in the North and could get a sense of how freedom felt, what freedom felt like by coming to the North. Martin Luther King is the best example of that. He had grown up, obviously, in Georgia, had gone to Morehouse College, but for graduate school he went to Boston University, where he had the chance to see, while not perfect, what freedom felt like. He also met his wife, whom he never would have met had he not gone to Boston University, in other words, come north. So he was a part of this Great Migration. And then he went back, now fueled by what could be, what the possibilities were, and then fought for the ultimate dismantling of this caste system that they had been under. So that was the other thing that the Great Migration did. And then finally, these people were people that the people in the South could look up to in a way, and they were the ones sending money back, sending money not just to mom and dad and uncles and grandmothers, but also to fuel the movement of civil rights. So this Great Migration had many it answers a lot of questions, and not just existential questions that I might have as a child of this migration, but also bigger questions, larger questions about how did we get from here to there. It fills in a lot of the blanks. And so the successes and experiences of these people kind of reflect what happened with all of them. Success is a relative term, and they all had varying degrees of it depending upon how you define it. But some of them paid a price as well, a lot of sacrifices.
What was the role of the black church in the North? You mentioned Beloit, Wisconsin, and places where there was intense community. Was that a big part of the church's involvement?
You know, actually the research showed that it was the opposite of that. That actually one of the most, to me, oddly inspiring aspects of this Great Migration was that it was a leaderless revolution. There was no one who signaled the day or the hour that the people should leave. There was no single leader who said we shall go and make a way for ourselves in the North. These were individual decisions, so individual, in fact, that the majority of people who participated in this, not only did they not talk about it, which is another reason that the migration doesn't get talked about in the way that I think it could and probably should. The families didn't talk about it. My own parents didn't talk about it. My parents make a few, rare cameo appearances in this book. Everything that you read in this book, the few instances in which I make reference to my family, I did not know about them growing up. My parents didn't talk about it. People might assume, oh, well, then she's just inserting a little something from her family because she knew that. I didn't. It all came as part of the research. In fact, my mother was one of the most difficult people to interview of all. That's a whole other story. She was bound and determined to not talk about it. It's in the past. It's, ancient history. Why do you want to go dredge up that? Well, I'm a journalist. What can I say? But eventually, I've read every page of the book to her, and that's kind of one of the things that got her talking, because it got to the point where she was interrupting me, because she was telling me about things that she remembered from growing up in Rome, Georgia, and why she decided to do this and do that. And so that's why I would make it longer to read, but more fruitful, because I was getting things from her. But to answer your question, the people not only did not view themselves as they often did not just talk about it. They did not view themselves as part of a great migration. They did not view themselves as part of a great wave. They did not view themselves as part of any movement. Each of these 6 million people, and I did not speak with each of the 6 million people. I can only say from the over 1,200 people that I did interview that none of them viewed themselves as part of the Great Migration. It's not as if I would go to a group of them and then I would say, I'm looking for anyone who participated in the Great Migration, and every hand would go up. I never even couched in those terms, because I had grown up the child of people who were from this era, and I knew that they generally didn't think that way. They generally just would say, they wouldn't say, I was a part of the Great Migration in 1953. They would just say, I came from Augusta, Georgia, and I went to Newark, New Jersey. That's what they would say. That's just what they would say. I came from Birmingham, Alabama, and I went to Detroit. That is how they described it. And it was a singular experience for them. And so to get to your question about the churches, what happened was many of the leaders in the South at that time were, in fact, discouraging people from acting upon their desire to leave, actively saying you shouldn't leave. And a Labor Department study, which was conducted primarily to try to figure out in World War I, 1919, it came out. They were trying to figure out how to stop it, but they couldn't stop it because it was within. There's no passport necessary. I mean, if they could get out, they could leave. It wasn't easy to get out, but if they could get out, then they could leave. And so this Labor Department study cited a case where a minister in Florida, in Tampa, Florida, had, from the pulpit, advised his congregation that it would be better if they stayed. There had been some event, some violence that had occurred before then, and he had tried to settle them down by saying, no, I think it's better if you stay. We should all stay here. This is the land of the ancestors. He had his explanation as to why it would be better for him to do that. The flock, however, did not agree with that. And as a result, they felt that he must have been in the pocket of someone who might have paid him to keep them held in this caste system. They didn't take to it kindly, and he was actually stabbed the next day for having urged them to leave. So that's how serious this was. This is quite serious. And as for the northern churches were in some ways the prime beneficiaries of this migration. Mount Olivet Church in Chicago, for example, grew exponentially to more than 5,000 members. It became one of the first mega churches because there were so many people who had arrived from the South that they were just taking in plenty of people just coming. I mean, the Baptists who were coming up from Mississippi and Arkansas were all coming to these churches, and so they were prime beneficiaries. There was a statement from the original Adam Clayton Powell that at Abyssinian Baptist Church there was not a single member that didn't have a relative who hadn't come up from the South. And so the northern churches were in some ways part of the receiving stations of this great migration and because at the beginning of the migration only 10% of African Americans were living outside of the South, and we must remember that they were spread out from Connecticut to Spokane, Washington. I mean, they were everywhere, but they were sprinkled, just tiny pockets spread out the rest of the country. And the huge, the large concentration was in the South. So it was in some ways driven by these people, and they're the ones that changed the landscape of the places that they arrived demographically.
Yeah, that's okay. Ms. Wilkerson, some of the most prominent popular historical work on the migration prior to your book has blamed the emergence of the black underclass on the migration. And I was wondering whether, or despite the fact that demographically speaking, the migration was really the foundation of what became the black working class and middle class. And I was wondering if your book is in any way implicitly or explicitly in dialogue with some of that earlier popular historical work.
You know, I have to go back to the original goal of writing this book. And the original goal of writing this book is, as a narrative journalist, to fill in the blanks of what had not been said. And what had not been said and what had not been heard were the voices of the people who lived it. There is not enough about the voices of the people who lived it. The people that I was surrounded by when I was growing up in Washington, D.C., who we just took them all for granted. Everybody was from North Carolina, South Carolina, and you just took it for granted. The people who I would meet whenever I was out reporting for the New York Times, constantly writing about everything, writing about the underclass, writing about the upper class, writing about all kinds of classes, and finding that everywhere I went, the enduring thread was that they all had connections to a particular place in the South, a particular place in the South. And I had not seen, there had not been anything that pulled all of it together, West Coast, Midwest, East Coast, all together into one place, and trying to capture these people before it was too late. When I began the work on this book, I began with a great deal of urgency. The migration began during World War I, did not end until 1970. You're talking about multiple generations who experienced this, 6 million people whose stories had not been captured while it was ongoing, millions of people who had not wanted to talk about it and would need to be coaxed into feeling comfortable to talk about it. And I felt a great deal of urgency as I went out across the country trying to find these people, because I wanted to capture the story before it was too late. I felt very much like the anthropologists of the 1930s who were trying to get to the last living ex-slaves before it was too late. And so that was, you have to think about the guiding motivation for the work itself. The guiding motivation was to capture these stories before it was too late, to make it come alive for the reader so that the reader can see themselves, and leave it up to the reader to decide how and why, what the motivations were, and what was the thinking behind it. Leave it up to the reader to decide. I mean, in narrative nonfiction, our goal is to show and not tell. And in order to show, that means spending as much time as you possibly can with, these are real people, this is nonfiction. These people, people will ask me, why are there no pictures in the book? We wanted you to be absorbed in the stories of these people. Imagine yourself on the road with Robert Foster. Imagine yourself out in the cotton fields with Ida Mae. Imagine yourself standing up to a foreman in the orange groves of Central Florida. The goal was to have the reader imagine and see themselves in this situation, and then come to their own conclusion about what this was all about. It's not for me to tell you what this is all about, but to just show you through the lives of these amazing people and to capture them before it was too late. And so that was the essential goal of all of this. And the inspiration for this book was not any sociological text, but instead The Grapes of Wrath. And I say it with the greatest sense of reverence for The Grapes of Wrath, because it's an amazing masterwork. I read it multiple times and love Steinbeck, as we all do, especially as a journalist, because he had been a journalist and he'd written about the Dust Bowl migration as a journalist, and then decided that the way he wanted to capture it, that there was something that he hadn't been able to get across, and he decided the way to get it across is to write it as a novel. Well, I'm not a novelist, but I felt that this great migration, which dwarfed the Dust Bowl migration by many degrees. There were 6 million people in the Great Migration, and that's an underestimate. That's the best number we can go by. The Dust Bowl migration involved 300,000 people during a fairly finite period of time in the mid to late 1930s. And so I felt that if there was a Grapes of Wrath to capture that migration, how much more relevant could it be to have also something similar for this one? Now, I am not saying that this is the Grapes of Wrath, but I'm saying that it was inspired by what that book did, by making it come alive for the reader. And you could feel yourself in that truck with the Joads, and I wanted you in the car with these people driving across the country, not being able to stop, on the train with them as it was switching over from the colored car to the integrated car. I wanted people to experience what that was like before it was too late, and to get those stories before it was too late. And that answers the question of what this book is for and what it was about, what its purpose is. And I think that helps to give a sense of what my goal was in telling this story.
My question relates to the black men who served in Paris and in other parts of Europe during World War I. After coming back from the war and after they had a taste of freedom, what impact did they have on this movement?
You mean the veterans?
Yeah, the veterans who came back, who were in Paris. You know, there was a song, how are you going to keep them on the farm once they've seen Paris? What kind of impact did they have on the migration movement? Well,
you know, a lot of them became migrants. I mean, a lot of them left and didn't come back. I mean, obviously, one of the people in this book was a veteran, and once they had been exposed to any level of freedom, whether it was being able to walk the streets of New York and ride anywhere that they wanted to, or whether it was a matter of being able to be treated as equals, or to be seen as American first and African American second in Europe, where they might have been serving. I think that it had the same effect. So a lot of the people that I interviewed actually were veterans, many of them, because they were of that generation, to have been veterans. And so I think that they go hand in hand.
Yeah, I saw you on Charlie Rose, and tonight you made you were good there, a case for first setting up that the experience was a caste system. Would it have been too inflammatory to have just called it apartheid?
That is a fascinating question. In fact, I made a note here in case that question came up. I would like to point out to you that I made a conscious decision in the writing of this book, and I haven't really talked about this elsewhere, but Princeton seems a very fitting place to talk about it, especially because of what I was teaching when I was here, about the narrative decision-making that you have to make. The word racism is not used anywhere in the book. It's not in the text. It is in a paper. I have to cite a paper accurately as the writer wished it to be written, but I don't use the R word in the book. I do not use apartheid in the book. I use caste system because I wanted to focus in on the structure. It puts an emphasis on the structure rather than feeling. It puts an emphasis on the perpetuation of an institutional need as opposed to emotion. It focuses in on how it hurts everyone. If you can just recognize, it's almost like this. It's almost like looking at an X-ray and seeing the undergirding of what a skeleton looks like. This is what's underneath all of what we often see and ascribe different words to. And I did not want the words to get in the way of the experience that was being shared by the people. The assumption, other people can call it whatever they want. I chose not to label them. I didn't even like using the term migrant, because I think that's, well, first of all, it's a misnomer. They were not migrants, because they were not moving back and forth. Once they left for good and were not looking to go back. But there were certain words that were kind of difficult. Migrant was difficult because it was a misnomer. The R word, the apartheid, I found would get in the way. The goal is to put the facts out there so that the person can see themselves in the people. And one of the best indicators to me, there's several really good indicators that was effective, has been an effective device, is because, first of all, it wasn't necessary. It just simply isn't necessary. I mean, it's much more powerful to describe what they were going through than to give it a name. I mean, give it a name, people have all kinds of opinions about what that even means. I think it's much more powerful to say that they had a black Bible and a white Bible to swear to tell the truth on, or that the people can even play checkers together. I mean, that's to me, that stays with you more than a word, which might be bandied about in different ways, and it mean different things. And that was why I chose to not let the words get in the way of the experience. That was a choice that I made. And I know that it has worked because I find people of all backgrounds will come up to me and say, when they read about certain things in the book, they won't say, I began to cringe or I felt guilty. They say, I was so worried for him. I was just so worried as to whether he would make it. I was so worried, and that worry, that's the emotion. The emotion that I'm seeking, Tolstoy said that art is a transfer of emotion from one person to another. My job in the work that I do is to be the medium between these people and the reader. And my job is to, by whatever means that I can find, transfer their emotion from them to the recipient. And I can't say who that recipient, who that reader is going to be, but whoever that reader is, I'm hoping that they get how these people feel. And so when I get that reaction from people that I was so worried for him because I saw myself in him, that to me says that was very likely the right choice. One other example is that I was on Long Island and a woman came up to me and she said, she was first in line at the signing table, and she was a grandmother, and she said that she came up, her eyes were already welled up, and she said, I can't even talk about the book because if I talk about the book, I'm going to cry for sure. I've made my daughter bring me here tonight. It was a rainy, cold night on Long Island, Westbury, and she said, but I want to get my picture taken with you, and I just can't talk about the book. I can't talk about the book because it's my story. I'm an immigrant from Greece, and you have told my story. Who knew? Who knew? And that was the goal. And so if the words would get in the way of that, I would not want to risk it. It's just too important to me that people see themselves in these people.
Ms. Wilkerson, hi. I just wanted to make a comment that I'm sure it's an honor to be on Charlie Rose and at Princeton, but I want you to know that I brought my mother, and her mother came up from Selma, Alabama, with 4 children on a train.
No.
How many children?
It was 6 children.
See how tough it is? Do you see what I mean? Do you see what I've gone through?
Okay, 6 children.
And she was pregnant with one.
Okay.
And the father wouldn't come with her. My father wouldn't come with them. But anyway, the boys were dressed as girls, as twins, because it was cheaper to have twins. They would be as one. And they had brown paper bags to eat and changed in New Washington. But this, like you said, is my story because I remember. But they didn't talk about it. Now you hear, I hear the bits and pieces. But also when they asked about the veterans coming back from the war, I have a friend that is a veteran of the Second World War, and I asked him why he didn't stand up and salute the flag. And he said, the way I was treated when I came back from the war, why would you stand up and salute the flag? He said, I had to go on separate trains. It was such a long story, so I could...
But let me say this. I am excited about this book. We're in a book club, and what I started to say is this. I know that you're honored to be invited to Charlie Rose in Princeton, but there's a rumbling. There's a rumbling from regular people that want to read this book. We will be reading this book. We're from Atlantic City. There was a migration of a huge population of African Americans to Atlantic City for jobs, and we just hope to hear more from you. We're excited about the story, and the story is not over. This is going to grow. It's going to be bigger than Princeton. It's bigger than Charlie Rose, because there are hundreds and there are thousands of stories out there, and we all want to talk to you. Okay? We all want to see you and talk to you.
Wow. Thank you.
I wonder if it might be useful to divide the African American migration out of the South into different phases. And students of migration often distinguish, for instance, what they call a pull-driven migration from a push-driven migration. Pull-driven is a migration of people who are dissatisfied from where they are. They could stay where they are, but they want to improve themselves, and they go to places where there are greater opportunities to advance themselves. And certainly the migration of African Americans out of the South in the World War I period and the World War II period would meet that model. The other type migrations that students of migration often speak of is the push-driven, where people would like to stay where they are, but for one reason or another, they're not able to, either because there's been massive unemployment, there's a war going on, they're expelled or something. And some, anyway, students of migration would say that the migration of African Americans out of the South that took place from the mid-50s to the mid-60s was basically push-driven. It was driven by the very rapid mechanization of Southern agriculture, and many sharecroppers who would have liked to have stayed just where they are and didn't have that driving ambition that you've described with regard to pull-driven migrations were forced out of the South and moved into the North, often in a very bewildering environment where they didn't want to be, and found it much more difficult than earlier migrants to adjust to the challenges and rewards of an urban society. By very virtue of the fact that they didn't have the same level of drive that earlier migrants, or that migrants that are pull-driven. Does that make any sense to you, that there are different phases here, or there's a higher proportion of people in the earlier phase of the Great Migration who were very ambitious and desirous to improve their condition, and the later phase, particularly with the mechanization of cotton agriculture in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And this may explain part of the difficulties that these people had in adjusting in the 1960s, and why the 1960s was a period when places like Harlem started to go downhill as decent places to live.
Well, that's a very huge question. Demographically speaking, though, it's hard to get past the fact that the migration went unabated every single decade from World War I to 1970. We just can't get past the fact that the numbers continued and actually accelerated with each passing decade. Well, it peaked in World War II. So that by the time you get to the mechanization that you speak of in the 50s, when actually the mechanization actually became usable in the field, and a lot of the farmers were reluctant to begin to use them because they were very expensive and they weren't as effective in the beginning. They're great, absolutely incredible now. You know, the great proportion of people had already migrated. I mean, you could stop at whatever year you wanted, and you still have a massive amount. The largest internal migration that's occurred within this country still would have existed even if you stopped in the 1950s, because the massive amount of them had arrived before then. But the whole thing about push and pull is very difficult, because if you talk with the people, they don't think in those terms. And when you ask them why they left, they speak of the circumstances in which they were living. And the one constant throughout that entire time was that the caste system was in effect. The caste system was in effect, and in fact, it was more difficult for people to leave in the 1960s at times, because that was when the civil rights movement was in its almost like an internal war was in its worst moments, and the South was working ever harder to keep them from leaving in an odd kind of way. One of the people that I interviewed, his name is Eddie Irvin, who left in the early 1960s, ended up having to. He could not even ask anyone the time that the train or the bus would leave. He had to go at different times of the day in order to figure out what time it was leaving. He wanted desperately to be able to get out. He described horrific experiences of growing up in the caste system, and he was 20 years old, a very young man. And he described that you couldn't ask anyone what times. You had to go at different times of the day in order to get an average time. Because when he went to leave, he only had the money for that one ticket. And if it didn't work that day, it might be months and months and months before he could try it again. He was in Mississippi. The day that he set out to leave, it turned out his sister wanted to go too. And she had her 2 children, and they had all of their few little belongings in a paper bag. They didn't want to seem conspicuous. They, in a kind of appearing haphazard, asked a neighbor if he would drive them into town. Didn't want to tell them what they were doing or why. When the man drove close to the bus station, he said, "What do you call yourselves doing? Are you trying to get out of town? You're going to get me in trouble." And so this was an extremely dangerous period of time. And we're talking the 1960s. We're talking about the period of time when one would be assuming that there were all these other economic forces at work and that they didn't really want to leave. They were sort of forced to leave. This man felt desperate to get out because of the circumstances of his life. And he said that when they got on the bus, they were afraid to talk. Even when they crossed over the state from the state of Mississippi into Tennessee, they were afraid to say anything. They were afraid that someone might pull them off the bus. He said that you didn't talk to anybody. Other people could talk. He said the white people could talk. We couldn't. We just stayed quiet and we sat in the back. And he said that as we crossed the border from Mississippi to Tennessee, I felt as if I were being unstuck from a magnet. So the whole idea of push and pull, I mean, the original people who would have left in World War I might be considered to have been pushed as well, because they were leaving really hard times when Jim Crow was being devised, and every day there was a new law that what they could do yesterday they couldn't do anymore. So you're talking 6 million people. When you talk to the people, which few people actually have, you hear a totally different story about what they went through and why they still can't talk about it. Why do they not talk about it if it were merely a matter of economics? What's so difficult to talk about? They were paying me this and I deserved that. But they don't talk about it because of the pain and the heartache that they had experienced to this day. There are things my mother still won't talk about. There are horrific things that I heard about in my own family and that didn't make it in the book. And so you're talking about deep pain that people experienced. And this is an effort to allow them to be heard. And I thank you for listening to me tonight.